We want to move now to a new report from the U.S. intelligence community that finds other world powers, not terror groups, pose the biggest threat to national security. Intelligence officials say China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia now represent the biggest dangers to the U.S. This marks a major shift from recent years, where groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS topped the list. The new assessment warns that Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and Pyongyang have demonstrated the capability and intent to advance their interests at the expense of the United States and its allies, despite the pandemic. Maybe because of it. And the warning comes as President Biden is set to announce a full withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan by September to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. Top security officials are expected to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee today. Willie.
Let's bring in the former Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama to talk about all this, Jay Johnson. Mr. Secretary, good to see you this morning. Let's start with Afghanistan and the announcement we're expected to hear from President Biden today that before the 20th anniversary of September 11th, almost 20 years since that October day when the first troops set foot in the country, that they'll be coming home, all of them. What's your reaction to that, and what do you think are the implications for the global threat assessment? What does it mean for the threat of terrorism from that part of the world?
Well, first time I visited Afghanistan when I was General Counsel of the Defense Department in 2009, there were things that struck me. One, it's a mountainous terrain. It is largely ungoverned space, very tribal, and the Taliban basically takes the attitude that we may have the watches, but they have the time. Not much has changed over the last 12 years. They've essentially been waiting us out until we finally leave. We have to be realistic that when that happens, they will likely overrun the country. They will overwhelm the existing government. There will be a huge setback to women's rights. There are not many good solutions. There is no obvious better solution to leaving. Ideally, there should be a three-way agreement between the Taliban, the Afghan government, and the United States, but that's not going to happen. So we have to be realistic about our options here.
What about the option, like Richard Haas was discussing a little bit earlier, small footprint, something much smaller in terms of troops, but on the model of Germany or Korea, where we're there, can easily tamp down any threats of terrorism that do rise? Why not do that?
I agree with Richard. There should be something retained in place in Afghanistan to ensure that no terrorist organization that threatens the United States can reestablish a caliphate there. I very much agree with that. Whether it should be a footprint as large as South Korea or Germany, I think is a very different question, and I'm not sure that's realistic.
The Secretary Peter Baker of the New York Times is here with a question. Peter?
Hello, Peter.
Mr. Secretary, good to talk to you. How are you?
Okay.
It's remarkable that we're here 20 years ago. I was a reporter at the time at the Washington Post. I actually arrived in northern Afghanistan just days after 9/11 and was there the night the bomb started in October of 2001. And I never would have expected that night that we would still be there 20 years later. And yet, of course, the concerns that you just raised and other people have raised seem very real. I wonder what lessons we should take from the withdrawal from Iraq, which was presided over by Joe Biden when he was vice president, only to then have to turn around and come back on some level in different form after the rise of ISIS. Is there a way that we can avoid that same sort of scenario where leaving even the small footprint we already have makes us have to turn around and come back at some point because of unanticipated circumstances?
Peter, that's a real risk. Lesson one, it actually is much easier to get into an armed conflict than it is to get out of one. Lesson two, counterinsurgency in a country as large as Afghanistan rarely works, requires a sustained commitment of very large resources, and was probably never going to work in a country like Afghanistan. We do need to retain enough there to ensure that our own homeland security, domestic security interests are maintained. I hope the Biden administration has thought about exactly what that needs to be. But those who know history know that very often we often repeat the mistakes of the past. And it's much easier to get into something like this, much harder. And we've been struggling with this now for over a decade to figure out what a lasting peace looks like and how to get out of a situation like this. I'm afraid that we don't have many choices at this point at the 20-year mark except to leave. I hope we retain enough there to ensure that our own national security interests are protected.
Jonathan Lemire has the next question. Jonathan?
Secretary Johnson, good to see you this morning. Of course, the invasion of Afghanistan was done because of the rise of terror groups who used that country as a place to launch the attacks on the United States. But that global worldwide terror assessment, global worldwide threat assessment, I should say, that we were just discussing, points to more potent dangers coming from nation states, China among them. Kind of wanted to get your take, if you could give us a sort of a global look, if you will, from 30,000 feet, as of whether you agree with that assessment and which nations, China, perhaps others, pose the greatest threats to the U.S. and what kind of threats?
That's exactly what this is going to be, a 30,000-foot assessment. I don't have access to the intel anymore, though Peter Baker and his colleagues at the New York Times are pretty good. I think it's important that the report highlights also non-traditional threats. In my judgment, the long-term principal threat to our national security is global warming and climate change, specifically the effects of severe weather events on aging infrastructure and the ability to upend global populations.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.